Welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us. If you can't see, we are recording this so that those who can't join us live can view later. You can choose to listen in French or Spanish. You can click on the icon of the globe and then choose your preferred language, French, English, or Spanish. So for the next 60 minutes with our distinguished panel, who I hope you can see, we're going to explore the science around how fisheries management is key to preserving the ocean's biological pump. And then also the political dynamic required for corresponding action that recognizes this critical role that fisheries management plays. But maybe before that, just a little bit of an explanation for those of you who don't know or haven't joined us in an ocean swim at one of the COPs or other activities. Our Fish is a campaign working to end overfishing and restore ocean health in Europe as a direct action of the biodiversity and climate crisis. We collaborate with scientists, some of whom you can see with us here, fishers and civil society groups across the world in order to accelerate a transition to low impact, low carbon fishing. And so who is our distinguished panel of speakers? We are very lucky and pleased to be joined by Professor William Chung, who is ranked as one of the 20 most influential climate scientists in the world, renowned marine biologist and IPCC lead author, professor and director of the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. Also, Dr. Emma Cavan, who is a research fellow from Imperial College London with a research focus on how marine plants and animals drive the global ocean carbon sink and regulate the climate and their environment. Then Isabella Lövin, who is the former Deputy Prime Minister and former Environment Minister of Sweden and co-chair of Friends of Ocean Action. Then Ska Keller, who is a member of the European Parliament and former co-president of the Greens and EFA Group. And then Dr. Guillermo Ortuño Crespo is a marine scientist working on international fisheries management and instigator of the Early Career Ocean Professional Program under the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. So welcome and thank you to you all. And I hope for the next 60 minutes or so, we can have quite a sort of a collegial conversation around these topics. This is at least being pitched as a side event to the ongoing CBD COP in Montreal. And so hopefully we can touch on some of those issues. And even for any of those of you who may be in Montreal, this I hope can inform some of the deliberations and discussions which will be climaxing and culminating in hopefully an important document at the end of this week. So fish, they're carbon engineers. I can't get this image out of my head of, if anybody's old enough and remembers Fraggle Rock, one of Jim Henson's genius inventions. There were these little doozers at the start of the program who were constantly constructing things. And I think what our fish has come to realize is that in some respects, that's very much the role that fish plays in the ocean, a little bit like those doozers. So the keystone of the ocean biological pump is the system which is constantly working to capture and store excess carbon from the atmosphere. It protects us from the worst impacts of climate change. And that's why the conservation of fish and their habitats should be mainstreamed within the UN processes, including the CBT, and reflected, importantly, in EU legislation, including, and importantly, in fisheries management. And there's a couple of important publications that we understand the European Commission is planning for early next year, which will be very good and relevant if they reflected what we're about to discuss. So, as I said, we're going to discuss this for the next 60 or so minutes. First, we'll hear about the science behind fish as carbon engineers, those doozers. and the potential for fisheries management to contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation. And then we'll open up for a bit of discussion between the panelists, but it's a short webinar, so we'll only have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So please do add your questions to the Q&A box, or even better, vote up someone else's questions, and we will answer the most popular, time allowing. So first up, if I could ask William, first question for you on the hotspot. So the ocean is home to millions of species, with many more waiting to be discovered. I'm not sure they're quite waiting, but they're there. This marine biodiversity provides countless benefits, ranging from food to economic and recreational opportunities and more. Over 3 billion people, almost half of the global population, depend directly on marine and coastal biodiversity for their livelihoods. So could you explain to us a bit the connection between this marine biodiversity and the planet's delicate climate system, and how that marine biodiversity plays a role in mitigating the effects of climate change?
Thanks, Mike. So marine biodiversity plays a very important role in the Earth system in moderating, mitigating the climate and mitigating the effects of climate change in many different ways. One of the commonly known and important ways of doing that is through photosynthetic species in the oceans and coasts. These photosynthetic species absorb carbon dioxide, like trees that in the forest that plays an important role in capturing carbon, and then as they sink to the sea bottoms, they bring with the carbon and then bury there in the sediment, and the carbon can stay there for a long time. These include like something called the phytoplanktons, which are everywhere in the oceans, particularly in the surface part of the oceans, as well as coastal vegetation and seaweed. And many of you know some of the what we call the blue carbon coastal habitats, such as kelp forests, seagrass beds, and things like that. And at the same time, not only these photosynthetic species, but also marine animals also play a very important part in carbon storage and sequestration. And these include fish and marine mammals. Their bodies provide is actually made of carbon. So the large amount of biomass in the oceans basically the storage of carbon. At the same time, as they die, they bring with them these carbon and sink to the sea bottoms, and many of them can stay in the sediment again and be buried there for hundreds to thousands of years, and thus contribute to moderating the carbon cycle and climate. However, what's happening in the last couple of centuries is that intensified human activities is impacting marine biodiversity. Overfishing has largely impacted marine biodiversity, as we know, reducing at least half of the marine animal biomass since the 1950s. And thus, you can imagine this will have a big impact on the capacity of these fish and marine mammals in storing and sequestering carbon. Also, climate change itself is also impacting the ability of these marine biodiversities to help moderate and mitigate climate change. We know that the ocean is already warming, losing oxygen. We are facing ocean acidifications, sea level rise, as well as intensifying and extending durations of some of the extreme events, such as heat waves. We already have seen intensifying marine heat waves are impacting and causing mass mortalities of seagrass beds and kelp. These are blue carbon habitats that help sequester carbon, and thus reducing our ability of these habitats to support carbon mitigation. Also, there are robust evidence that climate change is affecting fish and other marine animals too, through shifting their distributions, reducing their body size, changing in their phenology, and in general affecting, adversely impacting the ecosystem functions. And all of these will also have a feedback that that reduce the capacity of these important biodiversity to deliver this service to help with moderating our climate and mitigating climate change.
Wow, thank you, William. That's sometimes it's hard to sort of reconcile the function and what you've described in terms of the role of the ocean and marine biodiversity in that, with at the same time as you describe the impact of overfishing it. Like, is it, you said half of biomass, marine biomass, known marine biomass since 1950, or sorry, has been removed through overfishing, or sorry, just fish stocks?
Yes, fish. That's a fish stock in general. Fish stocks, but fish stocks for animal biomass, it actually contribute a substantial amount of animal biomass, and that's basically, I think, fishing is one of the most effective way of moving biomass from the ocean. It's basically it just the net take out fish from the oceans, and in fact the target, traditionally, the target of fishing is to remove at least half of the biomass from the oceans, and that's why they aim for this traditional way of thinking of maximum sustainable yield, and that basically is aiming to remove large amount of biomass from the oceans. That can also help achieve that specific target.
Which is extraordinary when you consider that. I mean, you also explained, of course, the impact of climate change, which until relatively recently, perhaps we've been somewhat ignorant of the impact we've had through the burning of fossil fuels. But overfishing has been something which has been, in effect, legislated, like a conscious decision. And maybe if I could turn to you, as Isabella, as not just former Deputy Prime Minister, but also as former environment minister and co-chair of the Friends of Ocean Action. How do you explain how decision makers have failed to act, or the other way around, have actually enabled overfishing, as William has explained, if ocean health and marine biodiversity are so critical to planetary health? What's the blockage that explains such decision making?
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Our Fish, for arranging this very important seminar on this topic that is quite unknown, I would say. How is overfishing contributing to climate change, not only through the fuel that it is used in the fleet, but through the carbon that is removed from the ocean, through kind of bringing up all that fish and that biomass. And I would say one of the reasons that we haven't really seen climate action on fisheries until now is that I think this topic is relatively unknown, and the mechanisms of blue carbon have up to until now been very much focusing on seagrass beds and kelp and mangrove and so on. But the actual kind of mind-blowing estimate of half of the biomass of fish being removed from the seas since 1950s and how that is affecting the capacity of sequestration of the ocean is, I think, really unknown and for amongst policymakers. And therefore, I think it's very, very important to have this seminar. And why has there been too little action on ending overfishing? I think you already pointed to one reason, and that is that maximum sustainable yield is kind of the measure that has been used, which is an economic factor rather than a biological one. So the fisheries science up until now have really accounted of kind of fishing down the fish stocks and then kind of fishing on the interest rate of the stocks. But the view of fish as an economic commodity is at the core of this problem, that fish has been viewed only as fish that you can eat and not as the species. Now we're talking also when we have the CBD conference in Montreal, so fish haven't very seldom been really counted, the commercial species, as species that we foremost will protect in terms of their functioning in the ecosystem, but rather been managed on the side in another silo, which is the fisheries policy and not the environment policy. So I think what we need to do is to raise awareness. You are doing that. I think it's excellent. And I think also with the ecosystems that have been so affected by climate change, which William described, with acidification, with warming, deoxygenation, also pollution. At this point, we have so fragile ecosystems that we need to do something quite radical. I think preserving and conserving 30% of our ocean is a minimum. I think we have to do even more. And if we really can rebuild fish stocks, we will have more carbon sink. We will also have more fish in the spillover from these reserves. And we can use less fuel also in fishing. So there's a lot of gains of really establishing real protected areas. And we have to do it not only in national jurisdictions, but also internationally. So it's very important that we achieve an agreement on BBNJ, which the world has failed up until now.
Indeed. Thank you, Isabella. Yeah, there's a lot of expectation around not just this week and the 30 by 30 target, but then yes, early next year, I think we all hope that there'll be an agreement on BBNJ. And maybe before exploring a little bit more the politics, Emma, if I could ask, I mean, you've extensively researched how marine plants and animals have drive the global ocean carbon pump, regulating the climate and the environment. I mean, it's quite a sort of a beautiful picture, which I think was part of the advertising for this webinar. But can you explain a little bit more to us the dynamic and how fisheries impact or affect that pump?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks for having me. So William already kind of explained this earlier, but just to reiterate, this pump of carbon actually gets to the deep ocean from many different forms of marine life, and that's why we need a biodiverse world and biodiverse oceans. And that starts with the plankton, with the single cells, plants that live in the ocean, and they photosynthesize and capture carbon dioxide that has dissolved from the atmosphere into the ocean and convert it into biomass, essentially. And that then kind of fuels food chains, food webs, and life in the ocean. And everything that is part of that wonderful and beautiful, as you say, Mike, food web can contribute to the sink of carbon to the deep ocean. So that sink can be through dead animals and that biomass, so dead phytoplankton, dead zooplankton, which are like the insects of the sea, copepods, krill. But then we get to the fish, and dead fish also contribute to that carbon sink. But what I think is even more important is poo. And actually, everything life on Earth ingests way more mass of feces than we do our actual dead bodies, and we have this huge rain of feces sinking to the deep ocean through fish. And so it's really important that we have that biomass of fish in the ocean to sustain this kind of sink of carbon to the deep ocean. And it's important that it gets to the deep ocean. Not all of it will, because it also gets eaten as it goes down. Biology is very complex. That's why this scientific research exists, because we still don't fully understand it all. But once it gets to the deep ocean, it could be stored for kind of decades, centuries, or even 1,000 years in some places. And the issue of fishing, which has already been mentioned, is this removal of biomass, which can reduce this carbon sink to the deep ocean. But there's also lots of different kind of interesting other things that can happen. And that's, fish are kind of midway through the food chain or right at the top of the food chain. And so they have this kind of top-down control regulating life in the ocean and keeping it going. We need predators, essentially, to maintain a balanced life on Earth. And so, it's not just about their mass and converting that into carbon. It's actually these other things which can be more difficult to explain and to calculate. And so that top-down control is really important. And by fisheries, removing these species that's obviously contributing to everything, but also the different mechanisms and the way that we fish. So bottom trawling, where we dredge along the sea floor, can resuspend carbon that has actually been stored there through these biological processes. So there are many different factors, and the fact that, it's a fairly new area of science that we're just kind of relaying to the public and policymakers now, we have that difficulty, and that is fairly new, but we do have some numbers, and so we can start to say some things to try and get some policies in place to start to protect this carbon pump in the ocean.
Thank you. I mean, it begs many questions what you've explained in terms of how much we know, but we still don't. There's still things we don't, and I think maybe we come back to that, because it's almost like, how much do we need to know in order to act? Which of course begs questions around decision making. Which if I could, Guillermo, I would like to maybe explore with you as a fisheries scientist and an ambassador for early career ocean professionals. What's your sense of what is missing? What's the missing element in decision makers recognizing the importance of fish in the health of the ocean? I mean, do we need more science, as Emma has sort of described? Or is there some other missing ingredient? And I won't necessarily go back and emphasize what Emma was describing as being so critically important to serve as an impediment to act.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to our fish for this really important webinar in COP15. I do think we obviously need more science, but like Emma said, we have numbers, and we have numbers to work with. And I think one of the critical elements that we're missing in this conversation is some perspective. Isabella mentioned that this topic hasn't been discussed previously all that much. So just to throw some numbers for perspectives for our listeners in terms of the importance of fish for biosphere. If you combined all the terrestrial and marine invertebrates and vertebrates of our planet, it's about 2.6 gigatons of carbon. Fish is a third of that. It's about 27% of all the living biomass of our planet, if you consider vertebrates and invertebrates. It's about 33,000 species. And we are overfishing those 33,000 species. If you then add marine invertebrates such as mollusks, if you add arthropods, if you add cnidarians, all sort of the aquatic life forms, it's about 80% of all the biomass in our planet, of all that living carbon pump, it's in the ocean. So fisheries, as we've heard from our panelists, have a profound impact not only on the target species, but on the remaining web of life, on that living engine that is pumping carbon. So I think we need to put marine life in its rightful place in terms of the role it plays in the biosphere and sequestering carbon. And in terms of missing elements, and as a member of the Early Career Ocean Professional Network of the Ocean Decade, I think that it's something that I haven't seen that we should be more strategic about, is integrating that next generation of practitioners who are acquiring this knowledge, who are learning how to straddle science to policy, integrate them into the conversation more efficiently, not as token we have one or two young people in the room, but rather let's make sure that all delegations that attend international fisheries management meetings are multi-generational, that we're bringing that next generation of practitioners on board who are going to have to reform international fisheries management or advance it and integrate it into sort of the climate change conversation. So of course, more science, but also who's in the room and how we adopt decisions is important. Like we've heard from the panelists, fisheries management is quite the approach is sort of old-fashioned. We think about individual species, and we push them. We reduce their biomass by 50-60%, thinking that that's how we can increase the economic yield. And we're not really contemplating, what is the carbon impact of our activity? How are we eroding the functioning of that biological pump? So I would say actually implementing an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. It's been written about for decades now. We're not really doing it. And then bringing in that next generation of practitioners who are going to have to, clean up this mess, if I may.
Thank you, Guillermo. That's you give a lot of numbers, a lot of, again, quite stark. But you also say, in terms of bringing these early practitioners and decision makers into the room, we are, of course, privileged that we do have an active sitting decision maker in our virtual room. So, I mean, Ska, as a member of the European Parliament, as co-chair or ex-co-chair of the Greens. You recently stepped down, of course, as chair, but as the new leadership of the group takes over, and as the other groups and the leadership of the European Parliament and the political groups prepare for the next European Parliament elections, it now seems quite soon in 2024. How do you believe we can improve fisheries management so that we can deliver a healthy marine ecosystem and then in turn decisive climate action? And maybe just to add to that, I know Guillermo just described the need for ecosystem-based fisheries management, but as I understand it, that already is, the EU has committed to that in the existing common fisheries policy, which is almost 10 years old now. So what do European decision makers need to do new or even just do better?
Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks for having me. You have forgotten my most important title, which is member of the Fisheries Committee in the European Parliament. That's where all the fun happens, where we're supposed to make decisions, even though, of course, a lot of decisions are also taken by the member states, like right now, just last week, and the quotas for next year. So a lot of decisions are being taken, and I have to tell you, it's difficult, and it's not so difficult because knowledge is missing. I mean, sure, this whole carbon sink stuff, that's pretty new and it's not so much in the discussion, but so many other aspects of biodiversity loss is clearly there. I mean, we have the whole problem of the fishers catching less and less simply because there is hardly any fish left, and that's due to overfishing, but of course also other issues like pollution, climate change, and so on and so forth. So everyone knows we have a problem, but the question is, what sort of solution do we take to there? And there, I have to say, the majority of my beloved committee is of the opinion that we need to loosen rules and that we need to catch more and extend catching time, etc., in order to catch more fish. And the only thing we should probably limit is the catching of fish of third countries. So we have a problem here, not so much of knowledge. I mean, always, of course, knowledge needs to be expanded, more research needs to be done. That's always true and very right. But the problem that we have is not so much of missing knowledge, it's the missing political will that we're not having that political will. Not in the Fisheries Committee, but it's also not so big on the scene that other colleagues would pay close attention to that issue. Fisheries is still seen as a niche product. You know, it's something where people say like, oh my God, why did you go into the Fishery Committee? Even though there's so many important things that are happening there. And I do think that more and more attention gets put there. I mean, with the whole climate crisis discussion, with the biodiversity discussion, the ocean gets more and more into the focus, but it's far from where it should be. So I do think what we need is public attention. We need the public to question ahead of the European elections or also any national election, because it's the governments who are sitting in the room deciding about the quota and not us as parliamentarians. We need public attention. We need public questioning of all the candidates, of all the parties that are running, saying, what are you going to do about overfishing? What are you going to do about ocean pollution, etc., etc. That's the only way how this issue will get more attention, and that we start creating political majorities, because right now in the Fisheries Committee, we're very, very alone there. And that's not going to change so soon. Because of course, also the colleagues will say, yeah, we care about the environment, but not too much. I mean, we're right now having all these discussions. First Corona, now it's the war and the energy crisis. Like, okay, environment is important, but not too much. And we're overdoing it. The commissioner here for fisheries and environment, he gets grilled all the time for doing too much and only environment, which is, I wish it were true, but it's not. So there is a big backlash against any sort of environmental protection, any sort of environmental legislation, and that's a very big problem. And then, of course, we're also having right now today, for example, interesting vote on renewables in protected areas, where, of course, we have a conflict of interest, which is not so easy to resolve. I think it's resolvable, but on a global scale, it's quite a conflict of interest, where we're getting inside of the ecological environmental sphere, we're getting into trouble there. Are you going to put windmills offshore where there's the porpoises, the last ones? Are you going to have, you know, what's the impact there? What are we going to do about that? And that's something where even inside our own, let's say, pro-environmental bubble, there is a lot of discussions going on, and it's not so easy. So, but anyway, what I'm trying to say is we need public awareness, we need public scrutiny, because without that, we're never going to have the political will and majorities to change things.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we often, you know, we often hear that it seems like there's a competition for public awareness and attention around. There's so many issues. There's so many issues that are important. And as we learn more, then, I mean, we learn more in terms of the damage or even destruction that we have inflicted on the natural environment. That we need to somehow translate this into political incentive. And maybe if I can invite one or each of our our scientists. I mean, particularly Guillermo, you talked about that multi-generational participation in decision making, even by, you know, practitioners and by the science community. What sort of, not even role, how can science and scientists not just provide the critically important evidence, but also contribute to that awareness and indeed political incentive? And that, I mean, if any one of you, Emma, William, Guillermo, has a sort of a key to that.
Thanks, Mike. I'll be brief too. I think my panelists will have better answers, but I think that translating the science into different metrics could help. Like if you remove 1 ton of this species from the ocean, not talk about only the biodiversity implications, but talk about like how much carbon sequestration capacity are we taking, and how many tons of CO2 would that ton of fish would have sequestered from the atmosphere, and how does that translate into carbon credits, for instance? How does that translate into dollars of sequestered carbon? Sort of translating that piece of the biodiversity puzzle into other metrics could help. I think politicians need to go back to their home countries and defend why they negotiated this or that quota. So helping contextualize fish beyond just economic, sort of instant economic gains, but maybe I think the climate conversation, sort of bringing in together ocean and climate communities is quite important, and that will help hopefully elevate the importance of fisheries management beyond just food security and economics.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. And just to, if I may, just to add to Guillermo, I think it is important to also bring up that the climate, ocean, food and biodiversity conservation nexus because our government will also it is supported by the people in the countries, and people on the ground, they care about the food they're eating and how they are being impacted by climate change. What I experienced with interacting with people through our research is that I think they sometimes feel that the international discussions of these climate policies is a bit remote. But then when they talk about like the food securities, about seafood securities, about the fish that are important for their culture, and then knowing that how that contributes to climate mitigation, and that all makes a lot of sense to them. And I think highlighting the elements of linkage between these different important elements and the co-benefits associated with conserving biodiversity, solving overfishing problems, as well as mitigating climate, really is it help with promoting that bottom-up support and initiative to demand the government to do more in terms of solving the problem of overfishings, more aggressive climate actions, and in general conserving marine biodiversity.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe if I could go back and sorry, Emma, do you want to jump in, or I want to have a sort of a follow-on question?
Yes, but I could talk about it for ages, so you carry on.
Okay.
We
Okay.
can, let's move on.
I do have a question that's apparently quite popular in the chat related to poo, so we'll come to that. But maybe just first to go back to Ska and Isabella. I mean, just William and Guillermo there explaining how, you know, there is this need for decision makers to make decisions, you know, recognizing the role of the ocean, or indeed marine biodiversity and fish and climate. But Ska, you of course explained a bit the dynamic in the fisheries committee. Is it that, or in the same way that burning coal is now not recognized as a purely an activity to generate electricity, but it's also seen as having significant impact on climate, and therefore there are other decision-making processes that influence that activity. Is it also a case that in order to, in effect, have better fisheries management, you know, should other decision makers be involved? I mean, should you, Ska, describe the dynamic of the Fisheries Committee? Isabel, I think you are also a member of the Fisheries Committee in the European Parliament. You know, is it time perhaps to relook at that committee as being the only one that determines the health of the ocean and marine biodiversity, and this pump that we've heard about?
I very much agree. We need to take the fish discussion out of the fisheries, or at least partly out of the fisheries committee. Definitely, we need to have the environment committee, for example, also look at it, even though there the dynamics is also not always extremely progressive, let's say, but I very much agree with that. And I think there is very slowly a momentum to change that, but extremely, extremely slowly. And I think so far it's been helped mainly by this whole biodiversity discussion, by Montreal, and by the conference happening, but also by this discussion about protecting areas, by protecting species. So more from that sort of perspective, it has been going out a bit of the fisheries sphere. It's not yet in the climate discussion, but I very much agree, we need to get it there. We need to do more about that, most definitely. But it's going to be very interesting, because right now the fisheries discussion is very much dominated by those who have an economic interest in fishing loads, and the political discussion is dominated by those who support those who have an economic interest in fishing a lot now and not later. So yeah, that's it's an uphill battle, but well, it needs to be done, so we need to do it.
Thank you. Isabella, any sort of anything to add in terms of that battle that Ska has described?
No, I think basically we all know that we already know enough in order for us to cut down on fisheries and be much, much more precautionary in the way that we're doing economic activities in the ocean. The ocean is extremely vulnerable, and we can see that with our bare eyes, actually. Many people living along the coast see that and know by their own experience that some species are disappearing. We see algal blooms, we see warmer waters. We see it, we know it, we feel it. But still, there seems to be so much difficulties in taking the right decisions. And I think the idea about integrating an ocean policy and really kind of doing it from the start, from scratch, to not making policies along the lines of marine spatial planning, only looking at what economic activities can we have, but looking at the cumulative effects of all the activities that we're doing in the ocean, and kind of seeing, okay, so how much can we allow, actually, especially in the knowledge of climate change and what it's doing to our ocean. I mean, the Baltic Sea has already warmed 2 degrees since the 1990s. 2 degrees. I mean, it's really a fever for the fish that lives here. But I wanted to also say something about on science, because I know the EU is also supporting and promoting an intergovernmental panel on ocean sustainability, like an IPCC for the ocean, which I think is a very good idea. I don't think it's an idea that should postpone any action now, because we need all the action that we can have now. But I think maybe that's also a question to the scientists, if your science is really being fed into IPCC reports now on the huge importance of fish in the carbon cycle, but because that could also kind of spur some action in terms of not adaptation, but mitigation on blue bonds, etc., where you can turn conservation into some kind of economic activity, although I don't like that especially, but it seems like we're living in a system where everything has to be kind of legitimized by having an economic gain. And if we can find, I mean, people are discussing seriously to invest in carbon capture and storage, which is really, really expensive. But if you could invest the same amount in kind of protecting fish, that would be a win-win, really. But yeah, so maybe I'll just leave
protecting them, or just fishing more precautionarily. Thank you. And just maybe it's Isabel, though, to push back on that in terms of the decision, where the decision making is happening. I mean, would you support Kaz's suggestion that the decision making around fisheries management, you know, perhaps it also needs to be elevated, at least at particular moments? I mean, you mentioned the intergovernmental panel. I mean, is there a role for a higher level decision makers to exercise influence or opinion over you know, what used to be, at least in Brussels, that crazy pantomime of 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning decision making?
No, absolutely. I think the definition of insanity is trying the same method over and over again and expecting new results, right? So I mean, we need to have new methods of decision making, and it's clearly not working good enough. I mean, we did the reform of the common fisheries policy in 2013, and we had some improvements, but still, I mean, it's too timid. We need something much more precautionary, to use the right word, and also using the ecosystem approach for real. And that would mean kind of a whole new approach to fisheries. And the thing is, with the fishermen, we know that if we kind of can restore the fish stocks, they will gain from that. And now it's a race that everyone is losing with using more and more fuel to catch less and less fish, and also destroying our ocean and its capacity to sequester carbon. So, I mean, someone has to have the political will, but also courage to take those decisions. And I completely agree with Ska that these questions must come up in the election campaigns. They must be central to the questions put to the candidates to the European Parliament, but also for whoever is going to steer the Commission, because basically most of these decisions are made at the European level when it comes to EU policies. And EU is also a very big actor internationally in RFMOs, in the UN, in regional seas convention, and so on. So the EU must be, I mean, a leader on this, but in order to reach that, we need to have public opinion pushing the decision makers.
Which of course, thankfully, you are all contributing to today in terms of the public awareness, and certainly I think our fish recognizes this as sort of the role we have. Thank you. And it may be just in response to that, we have a number of questions from our audience. So if I could go to one, which seems to be particularly popular. Emma, you may have provoked it with your talk. So this is to you. Do we know how much poo and dead fish contributes to overall carbon sequestration, and how does it compare to the blue carbon habitats?
Yeah, great question. So yes and no. We can provide some kind of rough estimates globally, and to put it, for a rough estimate, I would say that's about 1 gigaton of carbon per year getting out of the upper ocean. And then how much actually gets stored in the deep is another matter. But if we kind of take, some rough estimates, then, I'm working on calculations at the moment, then it is of the same order of magnitude and equivalent to those coastal carbon vegetation stores, so like mangroves, seagrasses. And, you know, it's quite easy to see how that can easily be, because even though these organisms are often smaller, like plankton or poo from fish, you know, the oceans are so huge that there's just a much greater surface area than there are kind of coastal hotspots for these vegetations. So yeah, equally as important, if not more. And the research I'm doing at the moment is really trying to compare this with like some physical oceanography to really understand that the carbon is actually sequestered. And that's really important, right? The carbon has to be stored for 100 years or so. It can't just be buried on the surface of the sediment or something. It really has to be a long-term solution. So yeah, work in progress, but there's definitely enough numbers out there already, and some estimates that we can do, which, you know, scientists were not overly comfortable with doing that, with, you know, putting numbers out there that we haven't spent a decade working at and hasn't gone through some like 3-year peer review process. But, you know, I've got to the point in my own science where, you know, you just see what's happening and you just think we just need some answers now. But yeah, it's definitely as important, if not more important, in terms of overall magnitude.
And then maybe, and this sort of translating that through to policy, given the importance and the magnitude, and given the discussions that are happening now in Montreal, what would be the ideal outcome of the biodiversity framework that we hope, the Beyond 2020 biodiversity framework that we expect to be agreed on Saturday? How would that reflect or acknowledge that role? Maybe this is a question to, well, actually it's a question to any of you. What language would be a win? I
mean, can I say something? Just because
of course.
I'm unmuted, so you know, I'll take the opportunity. Yeah, and I noticed there's something on the Q&A in this as well, right? That yes, we want to designate so much amount of like area of ocean to be protected, but there's this whole issue of paper parks, and we know that there's still trawling going on in marine protected areas. So there needs to be like a change in the narrative and a change in the language. And maybe actually what we need is money, because it's really hard to patrol the oceans. And, you know, if you have money and backing behind these things, then that could improve it. And I found it really interesting what Scar was saying about, actually it's like the change in the public opinion will help change the policy, because I hope I'm not deviating too much, Mike, but you know, as scientists we get told we need to like influence policy and influence things that are going on in Montreal now, and actually maybe we need to focus more on the public. And I think that, you know, if we can, part of what could come out of Montreal or in the future is to hold companies and like massive conglomerates to account for their actions. Because if consumers can see them changing, you know, for instance, like Amazon, you know, Amazon Prime delivering, you know, it's huge amount polluting the ocean, but then we don't really care as a consumer about that. We just think about the usefulness. But then Amazon could be using carbon credits by some scheme that isn't necessarily regulated very well. And, you know, if we knew that it was contributing to fishing or something, but I just think that, you know, businesses can have a huge power by regulating them that can influence the consumer. And also, just to say one last thing, that I think upskilling ocean literacy is really important. In schools, we don't get taught about the ocean very much, but at least in the UK anyway. And, you know, so then people don't know that they should care about it, or they don't think about buying fish. And so that's something that also what's going on in Montreal, and I know in the climate COPs, there was a lot of talk about ocean literacy, and I think it's a very long-term solution, but I think that could really help in the future as well.
Yeah, on one hand, it's a very long-term one, but as Isabella has reminded us, the common fisheries policy is 10 years old, and I don't think another famous Swede, it didn't take her 10 years to become a transformative actor on climate. So in terms of investments, you can have a lot of change, and ocean literacy is a really critical element and a missing element, as you say. I mean, I didn't have it either, but I guess at least I'm a bit too old for that. But maybe on the money issue, subsidies is a real driver, and there's been a lot of discussion about the role of subsidies. And so maybe would one of you want to broach this other question we've had, is what's the role of commercial fishing or fuel subsidies in fisheries, and of course in fueling overfishing and the related climate impacts? And so what are the best policy interventions to address existing subsidies for harmful fishing? I mean, I guess perhaps just stop there.
Maybe I can start first and other colleagues can
of course,
contribute. I think for example, one of the study that we did led by Gail Marina, we studied the contributions of these large pelagic fish and to carbon sequestrations, and through the pathway that we discussed, and Alma already explained really clearly about how the fish is a source of carbon storage, and that it will bring the carbons to the ocean C4 and when they die down. So and we look at that particular aspect of carbon sequestration by these big fish and how fishing actually affects that potential capacity of the oceans to store and sequester carbon. And what we find is that in large area of what we call the hotspot of this carbon sequestration process in the ocean is also area where there are lots of fishing that's happening, and that's kind of reasonable because this is where the fish are found, particularly the large pelagics, tunas, billfish. Those are the fish that are targeted by these distant water fishing fleets. But then we also did calculations and find that if subsidies are removed, many of these areas becomes actually unprofitable to fish. So what it means is that subsidies actually is indirectly supporting the reductions of the ocean capacity to reduce this carbon sequestration potential. And so I think in addition to that, a lot of this area would also require lots of fuel to get there and to do fishing. So that is also a big component of the carbon sequestered by fishing activities, or carbon emitted by fishing activities. So at the same time, these subsidies also promote activities and lead to more carbon being emitted than what is economically makes sense if without the subsidies.
Thank you, William. And it's mind-boggling that we're actually subsidizing, in effect, to harm. Not only are we overfishing, but we're actually then also in effect subsidizing fishing pressure and perhaps even overfishing. Extraordinary. Isabella, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we should be subsidizing a switch to renewable fuels or some alternative fuels, not kind of locking the fishing fleet into a dependency on fossil fuels, which we're doing now. And I think it's really important. I mean, ideally, I would like to see the whole fisheries policy integrated into a marine, not a marine, but an ocean policy to really protect our oceans from I mean, looking at with fresh eyes. But we still could also isolate the fisheries policy and have a plan on how to decarbonize and look at all the types of ways that fishing is now impacting our climate, going from fuels, but also removing fish, but also destroying the seafloor through bottom trawling, which is also releasing a lot of carbon and destroying the potential of carbon sequestration. So a real action plan on how to reduce the climate impact on all these fields would be number one to do. But of course, we also need to factor in biodiversity, ecosystem functioning and all of that. But decarbonizing is what we need to do with the Green Deal and with the Paris Agreement. So everything needs to be done that can be done there.
Yeah, thank you. I just know, or I understand, the European Commission, to bring it back to Europe, is going to bring out a decarbonization plan early next year. And in addition to which, they've also, I think it's long overdue, perhaps 2 years overdue, their action plan on fisheries and marine ecosystems. So very much hope some of these elements can be addressed by those. And Guillermo, you also want to come in.
Thanks, Mike. Just very briefly, since participants of COP15 are going to spend quite some time discussing how much of the planet we should put aside through spatial management. And this is not to say that spatial management is not important as a spatial ecologist. I believe in 30 by 30, no question. But in the ocean, we should also remember that a lot of the species that we're talking about, the migratory, the pelagic fish that William was mentioning, are highly mobile and will leave that 30% protected area, right? It is estimated that we have about 16,000 transboundary marine species. So as we work towards that 30 by 30, we should not forget the remaining 70. And I'm really glad that Arfish is bringing this topic up in a webinar, because fisheries management that deals with that remaining 70% outside of the protected areas, we could overfish every single migratory species with 30% protected areas, maybe 40 or even 50% protected areas, just because they move so much. So fisheries management has to be part of the conversation moving forward, not just to complement that 30 by 30 mission.
Excellent. Thank you. That's a really good point. And of course, that opens up, I guess, the whole issue around the high seas and how that's managed, even once a treaty is in place. The motivation, to go back to that issue of political incentive, what the incentive will be, the reward for states investing in conservation or precautionary measures outside of their sphere, let's say, of political interest. I'm conscious on time, and maybe just one last question, if I may, is, given that we're also talking to a Montreal audience, is there one sort of closing message or request that you would make of participants, and if we're lucky in the audience, if there's delegates in Montreal, what would you sort of ask them to deliver on Saturday when they conclude? Who'd like to go first?
Yeah, so maybe I can go first. So I think a message that we need a portfolio of solutions to help conserve marine biodiversity that also would help mitigate as well as adapt to climate change as well. And these include, as panelists and colleagues highlight, solving the overfishing problems, in addition to setting up marine protected areas. I think that they are not mutually exclusive and should be actually complement with one another. And in fact, with fisheries management, like what we discussed earlier, we should shift from the traditional economic view of trying to focus on economic protections to actually more conservation focus. Many of the fish stocks are already overexploited and in need of rebuilding. We know that we need to be conservation focused in order to rebuild these fish stocks. At the same time, under climate change, the ability to rebuild these fish stocks will also be affected, and that we need a conservation focused rebuilding fisheries management plan in order to actually effectively rebuild these fish stocks under climate change, and at the same time helping these fish stocks to contribute to mitigating carbon through the various processes that we discussed.
Excellent. Thank you, William.
I would maybe add that the final declaration ideally should be concrete and be specific and be binding. Because as we discussed, I mean, obviously we need to have those percentage targets, but they also need to have a clear impact. I mean, if we have the paper parks where you can still go bottom trawling and obviously it's protected, I mean, that doesn't help anyone, but we need to have it very concretely, very specifically protected, and it needs to be binding and not, okay, we shall see if we may consider doing something about this in the next 20 years, because it's so high time and it's really last chance to save the oceans. And with that, all of us, right? It's about saving humans.
Indeed. No small task.
Yeah.
Isabella.
Yeah, well, a binding agreement. I think what we need at this point is accountability. We've had all these fancy words and big promises for a long, long time. We should have had sustainable fisheries by 2012 or 2015, sorry, and now 2020. Now we're aiming at 2030. No, okay. So we really need some kind of accountability. So binding agreements would be what we must have at this point. And also when talking about protected areas, I'm all for that, but we also need to look at the quality of those areas, how the ecosystems are interconnected, and so we have a diversity also of protected areas. So yeah, and as Ska says, this is not only about, you know, some kind of abstract kind of thing that we shouldn't care about. This is about us. This is about the life on this planet, and I think that message needs to get through.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Our blue planet. Yeah, Emma, Guillermo.
Sorry, go ahead, Emma.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just quickly, because I think we're at time. But I mean, what everyone else has said, and let's save the poo, I guess. But also just in general, like just to get the oceans, you know, with their own messages, their own text, and highlighted, you know, separately as, you know, maybe saying the oceans are even at more threat than some, you know, the land, because of also their role in regulating the heat and carbon and stuff. So just really highlighting oceans, just simply, would be great.
Excellent. Thank you. Guillermo.
Just to echo that, like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, over 3/4 of all the biomass, animal biomass of our planet lives in the ocean, and the largest direct stressor on that is fishing, both all sorts of fishing. So we cannot discuss the planet's biological carbon pump without talking about overfishing and destructive fishing and bycatch and biodiversity loss. We simply cannot make it. So fisheries has to be part of the CBD conversation in COP15, COP16, COP17, and moving forward. We've ignored it for far too long.
Those are very powerful messages, and I very much hope that there are folk in Montreal and indeed in Brussels who've heard those messages and will act on them. And with that, I mean, we're a little bit over time, so it just leaves me to thank our panelists, Professor William Chung, Dr. Emma Cavan, Isabella Levine, Ska Keller, and Dr. Guillermo Ortuno Crespo. Thank you very much for giving us your time and sharing your opinions and your expertise. And please do continue to follow our fish on social media, as we will be planning further activities and updating you on how these opinions and this wisdom is being translated into action in the coming weeks and months. Thank you all.